Good morning. Welcome to this session of the Welsh Affairs Committee, and today we're looking at support for businesses in Wales, specifically access to finance. We're delighted to be joined for the first panel of this session by Ken Cooper, who's Managing Director of Venture Capital Solutions at the British Business Bank. We're joined by Rhian Elston, Investment Director from the Development Bank of Wales, and by Giles Thorley, who's the Chief Executive Officer for the Development Bank of Wales. And perhaps I can start the discussion this morning by asking a fairly general question. I mean, all of us are familiar with the business landscape in our own individual constituencies across Wales. We were all involved in supporting our small businesses through the COVID experience and helping them get access to supporting funds. So we have kind of lots of partial bits of information, but you obviously are in positions where you see get a more strategic picture of the funding landscape. And so perhaps we can start the discussion by asking you to give your thoughts on the funding challenges for businesses across Wales, where you think there's been some improvement in recent years. And that would be a useful starting point for the discussion. So, Ms. Elston, would you like to start?
Yes, of course, no problem. So I think a couple of things that we're seeing, and actually it's quite timely because we've got a report that's due to come out shortly that surveyed a number of businesses across Wales, and what that showed us was around 50% of businesses in Wales were accessing finance. So that gives you a good benchmark as to where they're at the moment, as to what they're looking for. And around 20% of those cited barriers in terms of accessing finance. So I think when you're looking across the finance landscape, you need to consider, yes, there are some barriers for individuals looking to access finance, but there's also a role for us to play in terms of increasing the desire for businesses to access finance and what they can do with that. Because what you want to do is move that 50% up so that they look to seek more investment and look to make that investment in their business and hopefully push forward with growth. Mm-hmm. The other area that we've experienced is how the banks operate in the market in Wales, and it's probably been no surprise to you and what you're seeing with your constituent members. The banking market has changed. There is no longer that personal relationship with the bank manager, so we are certainly finding that businesses that we talk to don't necessarily have that single point of contact that they can go to. And we're seeing more challenger banks in Wales, some more of the alternative funders coming through, but they do tend to look at structures that are perhaps more short-term loans for businesses, and we've seen an increase in demand for more patient capital, longer-term, either loan investment or hopefully equity investment into those businesses as well.
It's a good point you raise about the banks, because certainly when I talk to the main banks, they all seem to talk a very strong game about funding small businesses in part of Wales that I represent. I mean, is that something that you would concur with in terms of the picture that you get? Are the main banks getting more money out of the door to Welsh businesses at this time?
I think the picture that we see is that businesses will often struggle, perhaps, to find the right person to talk to, perhaps particularly if they're a smaller business, to access the right individual in the bank. Mm-hmm. And we certainly see sectors where perhaps the banks are less keen to invest. An example at the moment, we're seeing quite a few care homes coming to us for funding, as that's a sector that the banks aren't particularly keen to invest in at the moment. They see that as a little too high risk for them. That's an area that we've been able to support. So there will be certain pockets, perhaps, of sectors that they're just not comfortable with, and that will come to us for funding.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Cooper, what's the picture that you see in Wales?
So I think the small businesses in Wales suffer the same as small businesses across the country. In terms of, I wouldn't disagree with anything Rhian said. The reason we've put the investment fund for Wales in place is because we've done the analysis and we see those gaps. I think your question about bank lending, I think the main banks do a good job for the majority of businesses, but where they suffer perhaps is that they have to lend on historic performance. And it is, it does kind of go back to that. There's no branch manager that can look at your business, look at your plans and make that decision. And so that's kind of why our funds have that management element in them. But in general, it's the difference is scale, not the types of problem that people face. But Wales is perhaps parts of Wales in particular much more difficult to reach for venture capitalists that might be based in London, which is why we're encouraging funds to operate in Wales and actually be in the places where they're making investment. And again, I'd absolutely agree with we see a high level of reluctance to take on external finance. So we've had analysis that shows that businesses would rather not grow than borrow money. So I started doing this about 20 years ago now, and we used to talk a lot about equity aversion, where businesses didn't want to sell a part of the business, didn't want to give up a bit of control. But nowadays we're seeing debt aversion as well. And that's kind of damaging for all of us, because if companies that can grow don't grow, then our economy is smaller as a result.
And that phenomenon that you're describing, is that peculiar to Wales, or is that common across the board? Are there differences that are Welsh specific that you're seeing?
Not really, no.
Okay.
No, it's the same issues, sometimes exacerbated a little bit by sort of difficulties in sort of geographic difficulties. So, connections, getting from Llandudno to Cardiff, which we were trying to do the
Almost
other day.
impossible, isn't it?
It's not that easy. So there are issues like that. But actually within the businesses, no, I think the issues are the same.
Okay, so there isn't a particular lack of ambition, for want of a better phrase, on the part of Welsh small businesses in terms of their growth aspirations and willingness to seek out funding for that?
I don't think we're seeing that.
Okay.
Any more than we'd see it in, say, the north of England or the Midlands. Yes.
Yeah, that's very helpful, thank you. And Mr. Thorley, since the establishment of the Development Bank of Wales, what's your sense of how it's changed and adapted to the environment around it? How would you describe the trajectory that you're on at the moment?
We've changed quite dramatically, because I think originally there was an expectation that the organisation would focus entirely on SME finance, and that is over half of the activity that we do. But since then, we've also taken on responsibility for other areas. Green finance, we have 2 green finance projects and a number in train. Residential and commercial property, we've built over 1,600 properties, invested over £300 million in, and 250,000 square feet of commercial office space, commercial space in Wales. We have a local energy fund. We've introduced a management buyout fund for smaller management buyouts, well below the threshold that is considered for sort of the large venture capital and private equity firms. I just wanted to raise one thing that you mentioned earlier, which I think is really relevant, is I think the banks are doing a good job, but we have to understand, we commissioned a survey with the British Business Bank, which we publish next month. 500 businesses in Wales, across all of Wales. And in terms of the sources of finance, 19% received their funding was overdraft, 22% was credit card, 19% was COVID loans, and so all of the rest is covered. So all what I would call conventional finance or more stable, secure finance is everything else. So that's so other loans is only 12% of the total sort. So whilst the banks are there doing a lot of good, it is some of the funding is very, very insecure, very short term, and we've seen a number of occasions where banks have withdrawn overdrafts on a relatively arbitrary basis, and given that that's one of the largest areas of funding, it's a concern.
That's certainly something I think many of us have seen in our own constituencies, businesses telling us that banks have called in the overdraft and changed the terms or refused them or something at short notice, which has kind of significantly affected their ability to plan and execute on what they want to do.
Yeah, but back to your point, I'm happy to write to each of the members of the committee, but we've invested in every single constituency in Wales. We've built houses. We've built 62 houses in Virginia's, which is our largest single housing project. We have offices in Llandudno, in Wrexham, in Darwen, in Newtown and Cardiff, and we have people on the ground across the whole of Wales.
It just in terms of the point about the posture of the mainstream banks in Wales, that picture that I think you just alluded to of kind of short-term changes in terms that affect businesses? I mean, is it fair to say that the banks have become more capricious in the way that they...
No, I think they've just changed their model. So we monitor this. This is ad hoc. This is sort of anecdotal sort of feedback. But the threshold at which small businesses receive actual physical support and a support centre is going up and up and up. In some banks, that's £5 million worth of turnover. Some it's even higher. Our average loan is around £300,000. So we're in a gap in the financing market, which is well below where many of the banks are operating. So if you are seeking funding from a bank in that circumstance, it's going to be online. It's going to be online banking. It's going to be algorithmic. As Mr. Cooper said, that will therefore very much depend on that business meeting the algorithmic requirements. And if it doesn't fit, the answer is no, and there's no recourse to anybody to verify why that is the case.
Before I start bringing my colleagues, can I just throw in one extra question, which is about the universities in Wales? We had all of the university vice-chancellors in front of us recently, and the specific point we were talking about then was the slightly peculiar dependency among Welsh universities on funding that was from European funding streams, and the difficulties that they're facing with kind of those funds coming to an end. I mean, do you see much kind of spin-outs from the Welsh universities? Are you actively involved in supporting businesses? Because it just struck me that maybe this something we need to get better at in Wales is seeing our universities really become drivers of innovation and growth, and actually seeing some successful businesses spin out from these institutions.
Yeah, I mean, I'll pass on to Rhian in a minute to talk about specifics. But we've spoken to all of the universities in Wales. We spoke to them on two bases. One, we wanted to know exactly that point about how spin-outs could be supported. And separately, we have worked with the universities on our economic research organisation, Economic Intelligence Wales, and in fact, Bangor Business School and Cardiff Business School are members of that committee, but we spoke to all the other universities about participating in that. The difficulty, and this is from my perspective, is that the arrangements that the universities have to support academics and or students with developing ideas are different. So there's no consistency in the sharing arrangement of IP, etc. That could be an area which could be focused on, and as a result of which there are sort of peaks and troughs. So for a number of years, Swansea was incredibly productive, and a lot of innovative businesses coming out of Swansea, that we supported. That has waned. Cardiff is starting to get its act into gear. So that there are very big differences, and that there's not been a consistent approach. And what we're trying to do is reinvigorate that and act as a sort of catalyst for those universities to have at least a consistent support in the finance side. Rhian, do you want to talk?
Yeah, it's a really interesting area and something that we want to do more in. So we hosted a roundtable with all of the universities and their tech transfer teams to understand what the barriers were. The really interesting point is the whole session focused on the barriers other than the funding. Okay. It was all around how do we incentivise the academic to move away from the research that they're doing to actually want to spin out a company. How do we, as Giles has mentioned, how do we standardise some of the IP arrangements with the university and the investment agreements? How do you share knowledge between the universities? Swansea is up there in terms of the number of spin-outs, but Cardiff have probably spun out more businesses that have been more successful in terms of raising funding. Okay. So there is lots of work to be done there, but I think what was definitely surprising for me is that we didn't get to the funding part of the problem. It was all about how do we get the business and the academic and all of the ingredients right to actually spin out in the first place. I think the only other thing I'd say on universities, which I think is another important angle for us, is how do we support R&D activity in our businesses in Wales, which universities can also support with. So it's not just about spin-out opportunities. How do we increase the amount of R&D that is being done in our Welsh businesses, and how do we increase that innovation, which helps with things like the productivity problem in Wales as well.
Fabulous, thank you. That's really, really helpful scene setting. Beth Winter, please.
Morning. Thank you for coming this morning. My question is to Rhian. How has the Development Bank of Wales succeeded in filling the gap of private sector funding for businesses?
I think it comes back to the role we play is exactly that gap. So we have to be very careful. We're not here to take the place of the private sector. The private sector is providing the lion's share, particularly of the debt funding in Wales. Our role there is to provide funding where the private sector isn't able to support. And that could be down to the deal size is either too small for them. As Giles alluded to, on some deals, they just won't look at the smaller deals that we do. It could be the risk is too high. It could be the lack of security that's available. So that's the role that we play, is to ensure that we fit that gap. And we flex. So we have done more. Demand for us at the moment is very high on debt finance because the banks have pulled back in that area. So we're seeing a lot of debt applications coming through. So we will move depending on where the private market is.
Can I just ask one supplementary? Sorry. We've done a lot of work in my constituency, Cynon Valley, on developing community wealth building, and we commissioned a report on Cynon Valley post-COVID. Yeah. And we're looking at the moment, which is exciting, to set up a development trust.
Okay.
So how do you support co-ops and mutual as a development trust?
Yeah, so we can do that. We tend to outsource that part of it to specialist providers in that space. So we work with 2 providers across Wales who have got the expertise of dealing with the wide range of social enterprises. So we provide the funding, but they are the conduit to the social enterprise applying for investment. So WCVA and Lanska are the 2 that have got the contract with us at the moment.
Okay. And do you look at using like local government pension scheme funds to be able to?
Yeah, right, so not specifically on that area. So we've got local authority pension fund invested in one of our funds. So the management succession fund, which supports employee buyout. So when a business is looking to sell on to their existing management team, we can support that with an equity fund.
So why not in co-ops and mutuals?
I think for the pension funds, it's trying to get the balance for them if they need the commercial return and they need the impact that we're able to deliver for them. So that was the first relationship with the local authority pension funds that we've been able to successfully get them into that fund. But hopefully it's the start of the relationship. We need to see where we go from there with them. They're very interested in the local impact, which is obviously where these kind of projects can deliver quite significantly for them. So
you are committed to the community development type?
Definitely. And the local energy fund that we mentioned earlier, that is absolutely supporting social enterprises to build local energy projects. So we've backed a number of solar projects, some wind projects where it's local community groups taking that project forward, and we've provided them with the funding.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ruth Jones, please.
Thank you, Chair. Can I ask Mr Thorley, in terms of the Development Bank for Wales, how is it performing in relation to when you were established, there were goals and obviously a remit set out. And how long ago was that? Sorry, excuse my ignorance there.
I joined in April 2016 and we launched the Development Bank in October 2017. So we're coming up to just over 6 years, yeah.
So in terms of your original goals and your remit, how are things doing?
I mean, we've the total impact that we've made in that time is over £1.5 billion, of which £694 million was loans. We've supported over 3,600 businesses, 39,000 jobs created or supported or preserved. We've built 1,644 houses in Wales, all with small or medium-sized house builders, a number in your own constituency in Newport. As I said, 290,000 square feet of commercial property space, and we've now have 2 green energy funds. And we've also provided solutions for other conundrums. So, for example, we provided a solution that we developed to support those people in properties that are their properties blighted by the cladding issue. Now, in terms of targets, we've met or exceeded all of the targets that we were set, and we've continued to grow. And we're now we were expecting to invest around £80 million a year, and we're now investing around £120 million a year in Wales.
That's helpful. Looking at targets, is it appropriate maybe that the targets for the setting of job creation and job security, do you have specific targets that you can be measured against in that area?
Yeah.
And is it appropriate, do you think?
Well, it's a good question because the answer is we do. We have specific targets for jobs created and jobs safeguarded. So, but we don't operate specifically to those targets. So I'll give you an extreme example. We could quite happily support a large call centre, for example, where a very large number of employees on relatively low pay, relatively insecure fund, and the answer is we don't focus on that as the solution to the target. We operate on the basis of investing across Wales, across all sectors, and the target is an output, not an input. But we do, as a result of this, we do collect data from our customers, including average pay rates, diversity, we continue to monitor the number of people employed in the business, etc. So and we're increasingly adding green or decarbonisation and environmental measures as well into the mix.
No, thank you. That's very helpful. I'll hand you back to the chair now.
Thank you very much. Robin Miller's got a supplementary.
Thank you. Just a quick supplementary. You've mentioned housing a couple of times. What percentage of your portfolio is housing? Housing-related business?
On an annual basis, about just under 40% of the investment is property. And we have 3 property funds in Wales. We have the residential property fund. We have what's called the stalled sites fund, which I'll explain in a second, and then the commercial property fund. This comes back to something that Rhian said. As part of our remit, we are constantly looking at the market to see where there are gaps in the market. And we found, almost as a surprise, I would say, that one of the consequences of the financial crisis was that the commercial banks stopped lending to small and medium-sized property developers. And the reason for that is that the capital adequacy rules changed, and it became extremely prohibitive for the banks to invest in those organisations. We're not talking about the Redrose, the Barretts. We're talking about the small local developer who's probably building 10 to 20 houses a year. And what was happening was those developers had no funding. So what they were doing was they were funding the entirety of their investment themselves. Until they built out a project, they couldn't actually generate enough income to go and buy the next site to develop the second site. So it was a very staccato approach to development.
If I could just interrupt you there. So, as I understand it, property development, it's let's get straight to the point. Very often a development is a shell company is set up for the purpose of a development.
Yeah.
So are you investing into those, or are you investing into a growing business, growing property development business which is growing in size? Because it strikes me that 40% seems... I'm not educated in these things, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems 40% is quite high in terms of an investment, a business investment portfolio.
Well, it's an interesting model because the loans are relatively short term. So we're only funding the development, the construction part of the process, and we're funding it at a valuation which is broadly in line with the cost of that construction. So. And when we start out with a developer, if a developer came to us we'd never dealt with before, we would have certain relatively strict criteria in terms of pre-sales of the units off plan, for example. As we've grown and we've developed with the developers, then our willingness to support them to grow and do more projects has grown with it. So there's an extraordinary development in Swansea that I'm going to see next week, which is one of our developers who started building a small group of houses and is now developing a multi-use site in the centre of Swansea.
Thank you. Okay, thanks. Just following up very quickly, and then I'll bring in Virginia Crosby. Given the proportion of the activity that's geared towards property, given what you've said earlier in your remarks about headcount and employment and protecting employment, doesn't that just leave a really important gap of the innovative tech-related activity that isn't about creating, jobs on the ground? It's that innovation that we need more of in Wales, but because it's not. Doesn't give you a big headcount figure in terms of new jobs created, and it's not about bricks and mortar like building homes in the coastal areas of Wales. I mean, are you sure that you're actually getting into that space and support?
Absolutely. And just to be clear, these are discrete activities. So we also have a tech seed fund, a tech ventures fund, and an angel co-investment fund. So we can be involved in a business from a very, very early stage right the way through their life. And in fact, a business that we've backed at a very, very early stage is now a listed company on the stock exchange. So, one of our largest investments, and it started at Creo Medical. So there is no restriction on our ability to do that. And for example, in FinTech Wales, around half the members have received funding from us. So that, as an example, and Rhian, you might want to sort of give some other thoughts.
Absolutely. And I think to your impact point there as to how do you measure that, because that is something we grapple with given the breadth of activities that we do. Invest in those tech business have other impact measures. They do create jobs, and they tend to create those higher quality jobs. So back to measuring the average salary of those jobs. They also have big impact in terms of the private sector leverage that comes along with the investment that we do. So that's the biggest area where we can have an impact, that for a pound that we're putting in, we're getting more leverage in from the private sector. So a big part of our role is bringing in other fund managers into Wales, and we've seen a big uptick of, there's a couple of deals that we've done with corporate investors. We've invested alongside Admiral's venture team. There was a deal based in Cardiff where Schlumberger invested alongside us with their corporate arm. Okay. So there's different metrics in that side, but it's absolutely a focus of ours to try and increase. And I think because we can do the seed, we can do the angel investment, and then we can follow on with funding Series A and beyond. That means we cover the full spectrum.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And I mean, time is up against us, so we're going to have to kind of just pick up the pace a bit.
Yes,
so Virginia, please.
Yeah. Mr. Cooper.
Yeah.
So why was it felt necessary to create a dedicated investment fund for Wales? That's the first question. Dedicated fund.
Yeah, I mean, I think British Business Bank's first foray into sort of regional funding was the Northern Powerhouse Investment Fund, and we that has performed very well. And what we've learned from that is that it really is necessary to have boots on the ground to make those investments. That we're not aiming at businesses that are substandard businesses. We're aiming at businesses that just aren't finding access to funding, and really because of where they are, and perhaps a little bit because of the ambition around that. So by having a dedicated investment fund for Wales, we can focus our marketing to encourage companies to look for external finance, and we can make sure we target our fund managers to cover the area. So although these are commercial funds, they're expected to make a return. The difference between these and any other commercial fund is that we don't pay the fund manager all their fees unless they're meeting those targets of getting out and investing in the regions, investing in a certain number of smaller companies and newer companies, and so that's why it's necessary to do that. British Business Bank has a number of programs that operate across the UK. And Wales gets about its share of most of those, once you've taken London out of the mix, obviously. But to have a fund focus that can do its marketing, that we can do our promotional activities. So we've spent the last week going around Wales promoting the availability of this funding.
So was it that we had the British Business Bank, but so the Welsh Investment Fund, does this represent a finance that wasn't previously available to people in Wales, or is it just a case of making it much more Wales-centric?
No, this is new funding. It was awarded 2 spending reviews ago. I think it takes a while to put these things into operation, but this is brand new funding.
And how does it work regionally across Wales? And if people have had finance from the British Business Bank, does it preclude them from getting this investment?
No, most of our programs are, because this is commercial funding, it doesn't suffer from any of those restrictions that used to come around accumulating aid. So No, I think we're actually quite happy if we can make an early investment from one fund that then gets picked up by another fund or another source of funding.
Is there not a case for just taking the money that you have and putting it with the Development Bank of Wales? I mean, are you clear that are you doing fundamentally different things, or actually slightly overlapping, or just duplicating each other's work?
So we worked very closely with Development Bank of Wales when we were putting this funding together. There may be some small overlaps, but actually I don't see those as particularly a bad thing.
Okay.
If you just for an example, when we did the Northern Powerhouse Fund, we would deliberately have overlap between our fund managers, because for a small business that goes to one fund manager and gets a rejection, there was otherwise nowhere else to go. So actually I think what we're doing is building the market, we're building provision, we're introducing private sector fund managers who are managing our funds. And whilst there might be some overlap on at the margin, our analysis showed that if we could overcome the search costs, there are plenty of opportunities in Wales to invest much more money than we have. But actually part of overcoming those search costs is having more people in the market, getting the corporate finance advisors and others to understand that there are options for small businesses, that it's not just going to the bank, getting a no and then giving up. There are these other sources of funding.
Thank you very much. Beth Winter again, please.
Yeah, I've got a specific for Mr. Thorley first. Your new fund is saying that ESG awareness is embedded into the support to transition to net zero. Can you explain what it means for businesses, please?
Yeah, so we've been proactively developing our ESG criteria since the inception of the Development Bank, and so so in addition to the specific green funds, what we're talking about is making sure that when we actually invest in businesses, we have an understanding of what their activity is. We categorise those activities in terms of effectively their carbon footprint. We're looking at ways to encourage them to invest in solutions to decarbonise or to reduce their carbon footprint, and we can actually monitor that.
And is that positive response from businesses then in terms of the requirements or the expectations?
Yes, I don't want to steal anybody's thunder, but you're going to hear from a customer shortly who has taken a loan from us to introduce their own energy production. What we find is actually that there is a significant amount of understanding within the small businesses about the opportunity to invest. It's not being held back at all.
Can I just ask a very quick supplement, very conscious of time, to all of you? How much do you fund less extractive businesses? And I'll give you an example. So in Cynon Valley, we've got Vattenfall. And I recently discovered that it's a Swedish company.
Yep.
It extracted £70 million from our community. Now, wouldn't it be wonderful if our community owned these businesses themselves? So, where is that on your radar in terms of funding less extractive businesses? Because that's been historically the experience of the particularly South Wales valleys.
Was that a development that they'd...
A wind farm
wind
development.
farm,
So which is
although they have a community
they have a community fund,
yes.
but I mean in terms of...
One of our staff used to be one of the people who invested that community fund,
So we...
About £2 million.
Exactly.
It is a different scale. So we're in active conversation with Vattenfall and a number of the
That's
other
just an example in
developers.
terms of, your vision for Wales.
Yes, absolutely.
And what about less extractive businesses being funded so that we create and retain the wealth in our country?
Yes, I mean the specifics on some of those type projects, the role we think we can play there is to become a shareholder in the projects directly, because that's something that Welsh Government... that local ownership element is something that they're looking to support, and we think the Development Bank can play that role, working alongside the developers so that we take a actual interest in the project directly, and then Wales benefits from the profits that project makes.
What about building skills and training of local people so that they can then actually develop these projects?
Absolutely, and then we can be the people in between, effectively, the local community, and that's the work we do on the Local Energy Fund. So we act as the financer, but then that helps us to educate the local community groups so they get the benefit. So it's scaling that up to look at the larger projects.
And your British business in terms of less extractive? Any comments you've got in terms of...
So I think our fund's aimed at small businesses. Small businesses tend to be stickier. Part of the reason we're doing this is to create economic activity that stays in the area. So it's not really been an issue for us.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think Robin had a super quick intervention.
It's a very current issue, this. ESG guidelines include diversity, and there can be requirements on firms to comply in certain ways. So are there diversity requirements or guidelines which are required for companies to access those funds?
Not specifically, but we do measure all of those criteria. So we measure young entrepreneurs, ethnic diversity, and also female entrepreneurs. So we have that data.
So the data, so we're about 30% of the investments that we do are to female entrepreneurs, which there's still more to do, but that's a good start, and Wales is actually doing quite well on that at the moment. The numbers are improving, so that's positive. On the percentage of ethnic minorities that receive funding for us, it's 8%. So that's tracking ahead of the sort of general population of Wales at the moment. So that's good. But, always more we can do in that area. And then the last one that Giles mentioned is younger entrepreneurs. So we back around 5% of the deals that we do are for entrepreneurs less than 25 years old.
So to be specific then, because there are questions being asked of the FSA about funds and registered companies in England and the UK, are there requirements about LGBTQ plus diversity aspects in accessing the funds?
Not specifically, no.
Okay,
but as I said, we do measure as many of these criteria. But
thank you. Thank you, Ruth Jones, please.
Mr. Cooper, can I ask you, in terms of the investment fund for Wales, how long is it going to be open to businesses, and how do you evaluate the success of that fund?
So the fund is intended to invest for 5 years.
Starting when? Sorry.
Oh, it launched in I'm going to say November.
December.
December. It was December. Sorry, we launched a series of funds. So it's open for business now. The investment period on each of those funds is 5 years. And as for evaluating success, we will have an independent evaluation done of the investments we've made. They've been published for the Midlands and the North, and it will be very similar to that at around the end of the first year. We'll focus mostly on the sort of customer journey, how people have found the funds, how accessible they've found it, and then later on we'll go on to measure those economic impacts like growth and jobs.
So there'll be a final summary, I suppose, at the end of the 5 years then, will there? Or?
It will be before that. I think by the sort of third year, I imagine we'll be showing the trends of those, and if it goes like it went in the North, then we'll have produced many jobs, lots of private investment, and importantly, lots of businesses that are going to survive without ongoing support, because that's what we're really after.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And Ben Lake, please.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Cooper, if I can ask you just a quick question to begin with. You mentioned in response to the Chair at the beginning of the session that you're sensing that there's a lot of debt diversion by businesses in Wales, and I was just wondering whether there's any clear reasons for this have arisen as a phenomenon.
So I think I would be speculating, but as I say, 20 years ago when I was doing sort of government equity funding, we heard a lot about equity aversion and not very much about debt aversion. Some of it could be around the financial crisis. Some of it could be that people now have a lot of COVID loans and really don't want to take on any more debt. But it's important for us, for the success of our funds, that businesses that can grow do grow and take on the right kind of external finance to do that.
Thank you. If I then can turn to all three of you, actually, we've heard quite a bit about the different funds and the different work that you do. And I suppose, just for the sake of clarity, really, how would you say that, in terms of your objectives and the work that you do with businesses, how does the work of the Development Bank for Wales and the British Business Bank differ? If I could start with Mr. Thorley.
Well, I don't want to sort of describe the British Business Bank, but specifically the Development Bank is a direct lender. So the activities, with a limited number of exceptions where we need a specialist lender, like, for example, in the third sector that Rhian mentioned. So we are directly investing the funds that we received. Originally, those funds were from the EU. Now they're from the Welsh Government. They're from the British Business Bank. They're from the Local Authority Pension Fund. And we invest that money directly in communities and in businesses and in sectors in Wales, as we described. We are also an agent for the British Business Bank. So the British Business Bank have appointed us through a procurement to make investments of the Investment Fund for Wales in Wales. And so that, I would say, that would be the main differentiator, that the British Business Bank is looking for partners to actually execute their funding. But I'll go further.
Will you concur?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. We mostly invest through partners because that way we can get a bigger reach and of course boots on the ground. And the other rather obvious difference is that we're UK-wide. So, but I think that allows us actually, even with working with DBW, to kind of share best practice and compare across different parts of the UK.
Wonderful. And then just very briefly on terms of the Investment Fund for Wales, I'd imagine from what you just said that there's a little bit of discussion between the two institutions beforehand. How did the investment fund come about, and what sort of discussions were there beforehand between the Development Bank for Wales and the British Bank, British Business Bank?
Yeah, and I mean, I think some of the context is quite important because we were seeing across the UK the end of the old European regional, or the European structural funds, and so there was going to be a gap in that funding. So really, our conversations were about how we can work together, because we don't want to just duplicate activity that DBW will be doing, but where the gaps were going to be and how we could work to fill those. It was actually a very straightforward conversation.
Yeah. And has the establishment of the fund changed in any way the relationship between the two institutions?
No. No. And just to reiterate the point, the Wales Business Fund, which was the last fund funded by EU funding, expired at the end of December of last year, and we actually committed the last funds on the 15th of December, and the new fund from IFW came on stream at the beginning of December, so it was almost seamless. The European Structural Fund criteria was geographic predominantly, so there was a bias towards West Wales and the valleys. But that was, whereas the Investment Fund for Wales is split by type. So there are 3 funds within the IFW, one for micro loans, one for a loan fund for SMEs, and then there's an equity fund. So in simple terms, it simply filled in the gap where we, from the expiry of the ERDF funding.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. Just coming to the end of this section, I've got a few quick questions to throw in additionally, if I may. Just in terms of regional spread of your funds within Wales, yep. Are you clear that there is each part of Wales, Pembrokeshire, for example, is getting a fair shout of the funding that you have available? Rhian, you're nodding your head.
Yes,
there.
No, absolutely. It's something we measure. So we look at the investment across Wales. We compare that then with the SME population in Wales. The majority of what we do is supporting micro businesses. Over 80% of the investments we make are into micro businesses. So we compare the makeup of Wales with the deals that we are doing. So that's constantly measured. And then, if anybody is looking that they're slightly below, we will enhance our business development and marketing activity. The key thing is we are spread across Wales. We've got the offices across Wales, and we've got the individuals based across all of the regions, and that's how we can stay in close contact. The other thing that works well for us is obviously Business Wales operating in Wales as well, and we've got a very close relationship with that organisation. I'm confident if a company comes to us and needs Business Wales support, we've got the referral mechanisms in place to go to them, and vice versa. So that's more reach covering across Wales. And IFW does, the debt fund we're delivering, does have regional element to it as well to make sure we get the spread. I was going to ask Mr Cooper whether you do go through the same discipline as Development Bank of Wales in terms of measuring the regional spread of funding from...
So yeah, we've also targeted. Yeah. So all of our fund managers have targets to do a certain amount in each region. Now those targets don't add up to 100% of the funds, because we want the funds to be large enough and flexible enough. But none of our fund managers will be able to meet their targets without going everywhere looking for investment.
Just for your information, we've invested in 191 businesses in your constituency and spent, since inception, £16.4 million.
Good to hear. Ben, you wanted to jump in at that?
If I may just ask a little
very quickly,
perhaps very controversial question as to end. Back to this debt aversion, and I'm wondering whether you've had any feedback from businesses who are concerned perhaps about the rates of interest that you're able to offer. Is that a problem that has been flagged with you by businesses? In other words, that the cost of the finance is too dear for them, I suppose.
I think businesses will always balk at the cost of finance. I think the impact of the sort of the sharp rising interest rates really won't have come through on our economic analysis yet.
Well, moreover, our loans are fixed rate, so they are fixed for the term of the loan. So for those that took out loans a couple of years ago, they're sitting on very low interest rates, and they haven't gone up like the bank, with the bank base rate, for example.
I would say term is more important. Right. So that's definitely more the consideration now. Would they able to borrow over a term to suit the project? And we can offer loans, 10 years, and in some circumstances up to 15 years. So that is more the driver around affordability.
And fixed rate offers as well over that?
Not always to that full length, but yes, fixed within some of the shorter lengths as well.
That's very useful, thank you. Yeah.
Some of us met a few days ago with the new leadership team at the WRU, the Welsh Rugby Union, who were telling us about some of the challenges they're facing with the repayment terms for COVID loans that came through Welsh Government. I mean, you obviously talk to a lot of businesses in Wales, many of whom will have COVID loans. I mean, is there a similar kind of legacy burden there that's holding businesses back across Wales because of these interest rates?
We don't see that directly. We had our own COVID loan scheme that we introduced at the beginning of April 2020. It was £92 million. That fund is now, they were 6-year loans, and that fund is now relatively mature and looks like it's going to repay close to fully. I mean, it'll be over 90% will be returned. But obviously, when we're looking at businesses, to invest in the business, we are looking at their existing funding as part of that exercise. But it's not something specifically that we see.
Okay, thank you. And are there any sectors in Wales that you specifically will not invest in, either because of risk or because of reputational profile?
There's the usual reputational profile, arms. We have.
What was that?
Arms.
The defence sector,
for example, but they're in the terms of reference of our individual funds. There may be, for example, we were asked to look at some works on a coal mine, an anthracite mine. We concluded that was outside our remit on ESG grounds, for example. It was preparatory work for a mine to reopen, and we said that the customer really needed to spend that money.
Okay, and British Business Bank in Wales, is there a similar avoidance of defence-related activities?
No, we actually don't really want to talk about the restrictions on the fund because we don't want people to think, I can't apply for this funding. So the funds are very open. Yeah. We do require a qualifying trade, so effectively a trading business, not a business that just shifts money but mostly without restrictions.
Thank you. So one of the current streams of work this committee is engaged in is looking at defence supply chains in Wales. And I speak for myself here, I've been incredibly impressed with just how diverse the industry is within Wales, and obviously many of these companies doing a mix of civil and defence-related activity. We are aware that, how can I put it, there's kind of an element of caution on the part of Welsh Government about being seen to promote actively this sector. So that avoidance of defence-related activity that you just described, Mr. Thorley, has that come from the Minister? Has the Minister said to you,
apologies,
do not invest in defence in Wales?
No, as I said, it's not in all funds, and my colleague has kicked me under the table and said that actually that's not the case in some funds. So I would concur with the answer from the British Business Bank that we want to see all businesses, and then we can help take a view.
The key thing for us is the guidance that are in our documentation is there any reputational issues that we need to consider, or are there any ESG considerations that we need to bring into into mind. So there isn't a blanket that we can't support the defence sector, and we have supported business in that area. It is about us making an assessment when the deal comes in. What do they do? Are there any concerns? We will sometimes refer that to Welsh Government, but we have got examples where we've supported the supply chain there, because, you know, my view is it is still an important sector within Wales. There are a number of companies that do very well, employ a lot of people as a result of being within that supply chain. So it's not no.
Can the Minister tell you which companies to invest in?
No.
Does the Minister ever make representations to you about specific companies for specific loans?
No. We have an independent investment committee. We have an independent board of Development Bank of Wales.
Have Welsh Government ministers ever made representations in their constituency capacity in relation to specific companies?
No, we will sometimes get asked for information as to what we're doing with the business. So we will often be asked by many people if a company has applied, where are we in the process, but never any pressure.
For example, in the immediate aftermath of the lockdown, I spoke to 3 members of this committee about constituent businesses who were seeking COVID loans, just to ask, what the process was. So we get that sort of inquiry from time to time, but that's the extent of it.
Okay. I mean, it's something that we would find incredibly useful, is kind of having that link to all of you, really, being able to make representations. At least to get a fair hearing for businesses and get a line of communication, and the stats that you referred to about investment in our constituencies, if we were able to get that, I think we'd all find that really helpful.
Well, I'll write to you afterwards, and I know Mrs Crosby was extremely excited. We've invested in 212 businesses in your constituency, £24.9 million in Ynys-Môn.
Okay. Thank you, Diolch. That brings this section of today's session to a close. We've slightly overrun time, but I think we all agree it's been an incredibly insightful and very useful first part of the session. So thank you very much. We'll move seamlessly over to our second panel. Thank you.
Thank you.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
So we'll go straight into it. And Robin, I'm going to bring you in first, if that's okay. Good morning. Welcome to this second part of this session of the Welsh Affairs Committee, where we're looking at the funding landscape for businesses in Wales and different interventions on the part of UK and Welsh governments to support access to finance amongst businesses in Wales. Delighted for this part of the session, we're joined by Professor Dylan Jones-Evans, OBE, who is the founder of the National Startup Awards, the founder of the UK Fast Growth 50 Index, and is an academic and has written and commentated a lot about funding for businesses in Wales over, I was going to say many years, but that probably adds age to you, Dylan. So, but it's probably one of the most knowledgeable people that we have in Wales on this subject. So we're delighted that you've joined us this morning, Professor. And we're also joined by Jane Wallace-Jones, who is a businesswoman from Wales who's made that journey of founding a business and seeing it grow, founder and CEO of a business called Something Different Wholesale Limited. So thank you very much, both of you, for making time to appear in front of us in person. So you sat through the first panel, so you've heard all of the evidence from that section. And I think, Robin Miller, you're going to kick us off for this panel.
Yes,
Robin.
Good morning both. Yesterday I had the privilege of bringing to Westminster 2 ladies, Rhian and Owen and Rhian Williams, from Sugar Space, a business in Llanrwst, employs 23. It's celebrating 35 years today. And I asked them, I said, looking back over those 35 years, what are the challenges you faced? And they talked about scaling up. So I guess my first question is, what would you consider the biggest barriers to growth facing small businesses, and particularly scale-ups, exist in Wales, and what's being done to alleviate them? And Dylan, if I may come to you first, please.
Right, okay. Well, there are normally 3 main sort of challenges for businesses scaling up. Not surprisingly, as we're talking about it today, access to finance is key to that. The second one is access to talent. Can you get the people you need to help grow your business? and the third one is access to markets, particularly international markets. So those tend to be the three main areas that we've experienced. Like the chair mentioned, I've been working with high growth businesses in Wales for, unfortunately, 25 years, and every year we see those are the main challenges that we see. And how do you access that finance, the type of finance in particular? And I'm sure you will ask questions about this later, but it's this balance between debt and equity finance that is probably the key to many businesses growing, and how do you move across that spectrum as the business grows. In terms of access to talent, if you look at all the surveys that that they do of CEOs globally, they say getting access to good trained people is a big challenge. You probably could have another sort of review on this, but there's particularly a role, I think, for both universities and further education colleges to work more closely with businesses to align to their needs in terms of the type of people that they require to grow.
If I could return you to the focus of finance, which is the subject today. Your points about talent are well made and taken, but you've argued that development banks should focus on lending to small businesses. Are you concerned that those small businesses are being overlooked? And I'm mindful of the rural economy, where actually the market is smaller, so the business tends to be constrained simply by that market.
As the previous panel mentioned, if you look at the remit of the development bank, and we're going back 10 years now, when the then Economy Minister, Mrs. Hart, asked me to do the review on access to finance that led to the creation of the Development Bank, which is what the sort of task and finish group that I chaired recommended at the time. The role of the Development Bank, we looked specifically at where the gaps were. And it's not surprising that the main gaps that we recognise is down to this, what we call, or academics call this, liability of newness and smallness. It's basically the micro businesses and the new businesses that can't get access to finance. So what we recommended at the time, that one of the major sort of drives of a new development bank, because in every community it tends to be those micro businesses that glue those communities together, from the valleys to the coastal towns to the middle of rural Wales. It's those small businesses, the ones that employ under 10, that really hold that, hold those communities together. And if we look at the statistics, it still disappoints me. 7 years on since the creation of the Development Bank, yes, of course, you look at that the majority of their funding goes towards micro businesses. Sorry, the majority of their deals are micro businesses, but only 6% of their funding actually goes towards supporting micro businesses in Wales. And in terms of new firms, we know that new firms can't get access to finance. And again, I think it was less than 100 new businesses were supported by the Development Bank last year. So in terms of that, there is that newness. But of course, they also play an important role, as we'll hear probably now, about how do you fund those businesses that require that funding for scaling up. So it's both startups and scale-ups are important in economy, but you can't just focus on one without focusing on the other.
Mrs. Jones, I have some questions for you later in detail about the business, but is there anything there that you could add from your experience, perhaps?
I think he summed it up really well. Those are the three areas. Two in particular, for me, has been funding earlier on. I mean, I've taken the business from a car boot sale, dare I say here, to a £12 million turnover now. So actually, when you talk about scaling up, that's been monumentally challenging in the early days. I mean, now I'm lucky enough to have a good management team, and I've got there. But actually, going from that one person on their own to developing a management team to how do you structure what I used to call a real business was very, very difficult, very challenging. I didn't find a lot of support at that time, although I'm going back. I mean, I've done this over 35 years. So it's getting better and better, actually, much, much better now. If I was starting now, I think I would have I'd have done it a lot quicker.
Thank you. And I guess, Professor Jones, final question on this section, please. would you say that there are differences or specific characteristics of businesses in Wales that distinguish them from the challenges that maybe a business in England would face? I mean, your point about micro-business is well made. I think the vast majority of businesses in Wales are micro-businesses, something like 90-95% of them, but by registration. But the question is, do they face different and specific challenges by virtue of being in Wales rather than in England, and can we address those?
It's a PhD thesis in itself. But I'll try and be as succinct and not do it in 90,000 words. I think in the main, you'd say they face the similar problems. I think there are two areas, geographical areas that face specific issues. The first is rural Wales, because clearly you've got a distance to market, you don't have access to the same talent, you don't have access to sometimes the same amount of funding, particularly now as we've seen, the withdrawal of high street banks from many towns across rural Wales. And the second one is the South Wales valleys. And I think that if we look at it particularly, there is a tendency in Wales, says somebody who lives in Cardiff, for everything to sort of flow down into Cardiff. And I think the future of the valleys has to be in retaining and building those businesses across the South Wales valleys. And I think if we look at the challenges they have, it's very similar, but of course, one of the things they do have is access to a large market, unlike many businesses in rural Wales. So, to me, who's been in this game for 25 years, I believe that, there's not that much difference between England and Wales in terms of the majority of businesses, but we do need to refocus, I think, our efforts in Wales on supporting, rural businesses who have specific challenges, but also more importantly to embed entrepreneurship into places like the South Wales valleys.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think, Ben, you had a supplementary, did you? No, you didn't. Okay, Beth.
Yeah, thank you. I find this absolutely fascinating because the work that we commissioned with the Bevan Foundation, in the long term, we've got grand visions for the valleys, but in the short term, the clear message was it was the small businesses that had to be supported, and at the moment, that support isn't there, both financially but also in terms of the infrastructure. So businesses where people find very, very difficult to access and get support, etc. And we've done research on that as well. Why do you think then, Professor, that there's only 6% being invested? What are those barriers? Because that is staggering.
Well, it is, because the other thing which is fascinating is that these are the statistics I asked the Development Bank to provide for me. So you'll have to check their veracity, because I haven't had time to do it. But those 6% of micro businesses actually are responsible for 42% of all the new jobs created. So you have to ask the focus, where should the focus be? When we did the initial strategy for the Development Bank for Mrs. Hart, we had a great group. I'd like to take all the credit, but I didn't, unfortunately. We had this fantastic group of different experts, and one of them was an expert from the corporate finance world. And they said, if you want to deal, now the banks are withdrawing, should a development bank, take on those sort of micro loans areas? But what you had, for every person, shall we say, working in a bank, they would be dealing with 150 to 200, businesses annually. That would be their portfolio. So I think there is scope to do this. But of course, it's very different when you're dealing with public money, when you're giving out microloans, to actually a bank doing it, which in the old days could just sign it off.
There could be changes to the infrastructure.
And I do think, we looked at Microfinance Ireland in particular as an example. They have their own microfinance separate to everything else. And when we looked at that, the emphasis there was, let's get the money out to the businesses as quickly and as easily as possible. And focus very much on, if it is a priority, like you say, then clearly, the Development Bank is owned by Welsh Government. The Welsh Government could change their remit to say, we expect you now not to do 6%, but actually we'd expect you to do 10, 15, 20, and to provide the funds to do it.
Ireland is a good example.
The Microfinance Ireland is worth looking. They did a review recently of its activities, so that should be available.
Thank you, sorry.
Okay. Very helpful, thank you. Virginia Crosby.
Thank you, Chair. Chris, Dylan, you had a vision. You had a vision for the Development Bank. Has it delivered on your vision?
Yes and no. The Development Bank is something that Wales seriously required. we found at the time, that we had a couple of researchers working for us, and we estimated the gap was about £500 million, taking into account all the money that was being loaned out to businesses across Wales. I think what we wanted to do was to create something that was unique, special, but more importantly, created a competitive advantage for Wales. We're hitting nearly 25 years of we're hitting 25 years of devolution in May, and it was always my aim, back 10 years ago, to say, what makes us different to England? What gives us that competitive advantage? And I know I've always been banging on about interest rates and all this stuff, but I do truly believe that anything that we can offer, that we can differ to what is being offered in England, can make Welsh businesses better. And if you make Welsh businesses better and better funded, then it basically gives us a better economy in Wales. And I really, still truly believe that. The one thing and I don't know if you're going to ask questions about the business bank, but we had discussions with the business bank 10 years ago as part of our review. And we always expected that if the business bank was to come to Wales, that they would work more closely with the development bank. And I know you raised this question, Chair. And I'm slightly surprised, to be honest with you, that a separate fund has been created. I can see it happening in England. You can see it for the South West and the North. That's fine. But Wales has a devolution settlement. It has a development bank. It has a Welsh government. And that funding, whether it could or whether it should have been done, but it could have been given directly to the development bank. And that could have built, particularly in the equity field, that could have built a very strong venture capital function within the development bank, which in my opinion is sorely needed. So we've missed that opportunity. And what we have now, which is really odd, we have two publicly funded organisations competing against each other. I know, they say they won't, but there will be, because there's not that many deals in Wales. And actually, from the point of view of business, you're thinking, great. But from the point of view of public governance, you have to ask that question, whether that's the right way to manage this. And, of course, if you look at South East Wales, the capital Cardiff, the Cardiff Capital Region has also set up a fund of 50 million. So if you're living in South East Wales, you now have got 3 funds, all funded by the public purse. And they will be competing. So from the point of a business, you can say, fine, I've got 3 funds I can go to. But from the point of view of the efficient use of public money, particularly at this time, was that the right thing to do in the Welsh context? I'm not saying the same for the rest of the UK, particularly England, but was that the right thing to do?
Thank you. You mentioned Welsh Government. How would you characterise the relationship between the Welsh Government and the Development Bank of Wales?
Well, they own them, so...
Yeah, no, but in terms of the working relationship...
Again, we did envisage at the time that we did propose one option was to bring the Business Wales into the Development Bank. I think there was still a hangover from the Welsh Development Agency days, so I think the Minister was, shall we say, slightly reticent in putting that forward. But I think we moved on since then. I think what we've seen, one of the models we looked at very carefully was the Development Bank of Canada. And they offer both business services and finance. And they showed us at the time a review of their services, and they found that those businesses that just got finance grew by say 10%. Those businesses that got the business support grew by 15%. But then those businesses that got both together grew by about 25%. I can't remember the date, it's 10 years ago. But the point was that if you put those together, and I'm sure we'll see, we can ask a real business person here about what that is. But if you put business support and financial support working alongside each other, in the same organisation, then a company can come to them and say, I need that. The other point, and I remember, Chair, we had a discussion about this 10 years ago about the role of Innovate UK. And it's still the case that, you talked here about innovation and R&D, how important it is. That is still separate. It's only last year did the Welsh Government sign an MOU with Innovate UK. In this case, I don't blame Welsh Government. But the fact is that we have all these support mechanisms. The biggest complaints from business I get is that I don't know what's out there and I don't know how to get it. And the whole point of getting a development bank was to try and bring everything in so I could enter through the door and somebody'd say, you go here, here, here. Or, if you get this funding here, we'll get to Innovate UK and we can match it. And that still doesn't happen. And I think that's a real challenge.
And so just to finish off, you mentioned the whole sort of financial and the advisory roles. You mentioned the business development bank in Canada. Whose actually responsibility is it for that to happen? Is it Welsh Government or is it the bank? How can we actually get that advisory and the financial role to
Well, it's, you have to change the remit, I think. I think, we have 2 candidates for the leadership of the Labour Party, and unless there's an earthquake happens, the next First Minister. And of course, one of them has said that he wants to undertake a detailed review of business support in Wales. So they'll probably come to you and ask for your opinions.
Here we go again.
But seriously, I think a time has come. It has been 25 years since devolution. We do really need to relook at this. The world has changed enormously. The world has changed enormously in the last, never mind 25 years, the last 5 years. And I think the way businesses now operate has changed substantially. We can talk about, the effect of COVID, how it positively helped some businesses, negatively. But you look at things like AI, for example. We talk about, the importance of net zero to the economy. There's a report by CBI this morning came out, as you may have seen, that said, the net zero economy is growing faster than the average economy. So there's all these things, I think. But if the Welsh Government now needs to take a step back, I think, and say, right, okay, does what we have, as I said 10 years ago, is it fit for purpose? I, 10 years ago, didn't think it was. And maybe it's now time for somebody else to look to see if what we have is fit for purpose, to make sure that businesses are more competitive and more productive. And if those two happen, then obviously it benefits the Welsh economy, which is, in the end, is what we're all here for.
Thank you very much. Beth, you had an intervention?
Can I just ask again?
Really sorry about this.
All right.
We'll ask you a question in a moment, Jane.
Very quickly. So why isn't there a single point of access for businesses then? Why have we reached this stage where we've got all these competing bits and bobs and
you'll have to. It's the art of the civil service, I suppose. I've got to be careful what I say, but I really don't know, because there's always, to me, it just makes common sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
You basically go through a door or a portal. And like I say, if you look at it all, there must be an easier way to do this. So let's take, for example, if I'm a you mentioned the university spin-outs earlier, right? Again, that could be another 2 hours. But if you take a university spin-out and they'll go to, say, Innovate UK, then they can get a grant for £50,000, right? So to get the thing going. The first thing I'd be doing is looking, how do I match that? So the first thing you do is like, is there other, so you say, right, we'll match it with, say, a microloan from the development bank, or do we then start a process of, is there other funding available? So what you want to do is to wrap around that support, so we take full advantage of what's available. Because the worst thing about this is that, and I think it's the same figure what we discussed, because nothing's changed much, Wales has only had about 2.6% of all Innovate UK funding since it started. Now, you're saying, well, okay, 2.6 is not bad for Wales. Let's Barnetise that. If we Barnetise that, we're talking about hundreds of millions of lost income to Welsh businesses. And I think you did raise this, Chair, when you were Secretary of State for Wales. I raised this in the Western Mail, as I normally do, and there was a response from Innovate UK where the Deputy Director, if I remember correctly, said the problem with Wales is that we didn't have good enough businesses for Innovate UK funding. Of course we have good enough businesses. It's just that, the process is quite difficult. So I really think that if we did review it all, it's not a matter, if you're doing things for Wales, it's not just about what Welsh Government offers. It's also, more importantly, about the massive amount of funding that's available for you from UK government that for some reason isn't aligned to what we're doing in Wales.
Very good point. Robin, you...
On that point, this is fascinating. This feels like an efficiency versus effectiveness argument. The efficiency of a single point of contact, but actually the effectiveness and what works for Wales. I mean, the UKIM Act was put in place, and the measures there were specifically largely because the Welsh economy has done nothing in 25 years, and secondly because actually the prospects were of a kind of an entrenchment and a separation away from the rest of the UK economy. So as a result of that, we've been able now to make these direct investments into Wales. And we see that in North Wales, for example, through the Economic Ambition Board. So I guess to this point, the first question I had was actually with the prospect or the reality of a free port, for example, two in Wales, but one in Anglesey, and an investment zone in Wrexham and £1 billion for the railway line. This has got to make the regional competitiveness of North Wales, it's a bumper investment, it's a massive step up, surely.
But it is, but you just make, to an extent, yes, but it has to, like I said, align with everything else. Yeah. You know, the time has come, I think, that we don't have, UK government initiatives working against Welsh government initiatives, that they must work more closely and more aligned for the benefit of Wales and the Welsh economy. And to me, I think we do need to look very carefully about, I remember the term was initiative-itis. It was something that Wales is always good at. If there was something new, we'll do another initiative. And all of a sudden you find out there's like 10 initiatives trying to deal with the same problem, none of them talking to each other. And I think with respect, Robin, I think that is absolutely critical. So for example, when the Freeport comes there, first conversation I would be having is with the Development Bank to say, right, what are you going to do to help us to do this? Or the British Business Bank. That's the first conversation I'd be having. And it's also, when you talk about national initiatives, this morning, a great Welsh businesswoman, Anne Bowden, is releasing the High Growth Women's Task Force report. The first thing that both Welsh Government, Development Bank, Business Wales, we should be looking at that report and saying, what are we going to do to implement that in Wales? Right? Because it's about creating more female high-growth entrepreneurs. So I mentioned now they probably will, but probably wouldn't have looked at that and said, what can we take from that? And I always feel like this, every time we have a budget, we've got a budget next week, there are always advantages from every budget for Wales, but we don't really take advantage of those advantages.
The examples you give are important. The point I would simply make is that when we asked the First Minister why the Welsh Government's response to that investment in North Wales to say it's not a priority, that straight away rings alarm bells and justifies the UK Government's interest in investing directly into North Wales. But on that point, do you think the British Business Bank's investment fund, and bringing it back to business funding, do you think that the investment fund for Wales makes a significant difference to the work then of the Development Bank of Wales?
It will make it'll mean that they won't. It'll be very difficult now for the Development Bank of Wales to set up their own venture fund, I think, because you already have it there. I'm surprised it hasn't happened. It was one of the recommendations we made in the report, was to set up a venture fund. I remember with one of the panellists, one of our Task and Finish group, talking to the Development Bank in 2014 about creating a venture fund for Wales, and we were turned down. So it has taken a decade to get it on the table. But I think the challenge is now is, I think it'll limit what the Development Bank can do in this area. And I think it was always really important, I think, for the development. Because if you look at the statistics we look at, and I can send you them, what you find is that with equity investments, the equity investments they've made, that for every pound they invest, they bring in £3.20, right? And that really makes a difference, because you want to attract that private sector investment. That's what the Development Bank are doing exceptionally well. But, those are normal equity investments. We're talking about a very different vehicle, because most of these are going to be start-up and scale-ups, and they can really make a difference in Wales.
On that point, the last question for you, and then I have some questions, if I may, for Mrs Jones. Is it getting easier for businesses to access capital and access investment then in Wales? No. And do they really care about a distinction?
Well, we as part of our, when we do the UK Startup Awards, we did a report. We interviewed 1,219 startups with Starling Bank as part of our process. And we found, interestingly enough, 89% of startups, and these are the most ambitious startups, in the UK, including, some from Wales. They're self-funded. They rely on the founders' funding. Not surprising. But then you find, we asked the question about what was the biggest business support challenge, and 62% said access to finance was their biggest support. So when you start a business, obviously you have to rely on whether they family, friends and fools originally. Yeah. And then as the business grows and needs that capital, it's then, not all businesses grow, but they need that capital. And the question is, are there businesses out there that can't get access to that capital? And if there are, surely that is the role of the Development Bank, not to throw the money away, but to look to how they can help those businesses to get access to that capital.
Thank you. Mrs. Jones. The business perspective, actually, at the end of the day, is the deciding one. We can argue and talk about different structures and initiatives from government, but actually it's the business perspective. What impact do you think the Development Bank of Wales funding had on you as a business?
Well, I think I've got direct comparisons there because I was with, I've had funding from all directions. And I think a very good point, just to stray off the question slightly, is actually finding where this funding is coming from, what funding is out there. And I think that's a really good point because it is very difficult to find it out and it comes from all different channels and you really have to work quite hard. I mean, I've been in business for 40 years and I still struggle sometimes to find out where the funding is available. But to come back to your point, I think I've got direct comparisons. I've got the High Street Bank. I've been with NatWest for 45 years as a business customer. They've funded me on various occasions. I've had private funding through Business Wales. Primarily, I've been quite close to Business Wales through my journey, which has been good. And they've given me funding from, I don't always know where that funding's coming from, to be totally honest, as a business person. It's just, this is available for this sector. And I've had Development Bank of Wales and Finance Wales earlier. And it's very, very different, very different. You've got, with high street banks, NatWest is my only experience, and private funding, it's a tick box exercise. It's a document. It's there's funding for this particular thing. Oh, okay, yes. That's something that I have a project on. I can go for that because that's specifically what it's for. Tick the boxes, usually in a very short amount of time as well. Do I fit the criteria? Are my accounts exactly what they want them to be? Yes, I've got the funding, or no, I haven't. Development Bank of Wales is a completely different animal. You have somebody to talk to, and I may add that NatWest, I've got £1.4 million worth of debt with them at the moment. My relationship manager changed halfway through last year, and I've never met this new one. And I think that's incredible. So that's the contact that I have with the high street banks. I have none with private funding at all. It's just done through forms. Development Bank of Wales, when I've dealt with them, I've had 3 rounds of funding. I've had an original growth fund, which was just put into the company for stock primarily to grow the business because we were growing so fast. Then I had a property fund. Now, NatWest did the bulk of the property, but they would only do up to 65%. I put in 800,000 and there was a gap of 300,000. I wouldn't have bought the property. I went to Development Bank of Wales and I said, I have this gap. I have no more cash available. Could you do that? And as they did gap funding for me, which enabled me to buy the property during COVID, which was amazing. And in the green loan, I did a very similar thing. I've got a very big warehouse. I wanted to put solar on the roof. It was when the energy prices were very, very high. So I went to the bank, I went to NatWest, they put me onto Lombard, and they said, yes, we'll fund you, we'll give you a 7-year loan at 7%. And I thought, okay, numbers work fine now, because you were getting 60 pence per kilowatt at that time, which was extraordinary. And I thought, oh, hang on, let's look at the history of energy. And you could see it was an extremely volatile market. It was never going to stay at 60 pence. So I thought, oh, what do I do? And I thought, no, with the war, no, I won't do it. Just happened to be talking to Development Bank of Wales, because I didn't think that they would be funding that kind of operation. I was looking at an MBO with them. I just happened to drop it into the conversation that I was not going to do this solar loan, and they said, oh, we may be able to do something. And I said, really, it's a £1.2 million investment. The only way I could do this is over like a 15-year period. It was almost a conversation, a throwaway conversation, because it was never going to happen. And they actually did it. They came back to me a few weeks later and they said, yeah, we can do this. We can do it over 15 years. And they gave me a competitive rate of interest. And of course, worst case scenario has happened. So I'm sure we're all aware. It's no longer 60p, it's 5p. So it's a very different income now than I thought I would have had. It is worse than the worst case scenario, and actually I'm still in a fairly okay place because of their funding. I wouldn't have done that at all, and I think, you know, that shows presumably we want generators. We're generating 1 million kilowatts of energy a year, so surely that's very valuable. So,
if I may interrupt you, you describe quite a varied landscape of funding. Just to return to that efficiency versus effectiveness point earlier, are you saying that that's just as you found it, or actually are you saying that there is strength in that diversity of different types of funds and different sources of funding?
I think, to be honest, if you're a business and you're going to not only survive but you're going to thrive, you have to be diverse. Yeah. I mean, it's really, really tough. If you just stayed there and did business as normal, you would wither and die. So you've got to be constantly looking for new avenues that you can take your business. And there's another challenge. It's the knowledge, which is exactly what you're saying. It's funding, but it's knowledge as well. Because, you know, there's only so much knowledge that I have and my team has. So what you really need is, you need the funding, but you need the little shining lights up there to say, okay, we're investing in technology. I know very little about technology. All I know is that I need to be investing in it. I need to be more efficient. And again, here's this argument that you discussed earlier about counting output by the number of jobs. My initiative this year is not to take on too many more people, which isn't going to go down well in the numbers, but it's about being a lot more efficient and investing in technology, investing in AI where I can, to make the best out of the people that I have. And yes, I want to grow and I do want to take on people, but I want to be a lot more efficient in the way that I'm working. So I think the way that we're counting numbers at the moment has to be thought of, because it's not, you know, I might not tick the boxes for everybody then. I'm on the accelerated growth program, been there since day one, and it's 7 years now. And I know a big, strong push for them is how many jobs are they creating. And I was speaking to them last week and I was saying, well, actually, my initiative now is technology. What support have you got on technology? And they didn't have anybody. And I thought, ooh.
Final point, if I may, then, just to reflect back to you, it seems to me that you're suggesting there's a lot of nuance in the kinds of decisions that you're making and the challenges you face. So it seems to me that the balance of relationship with people who can help you explore that, plus also the speed and access of a tick box exercise, are both important to you as a business. Is that a fair summary of what you're saying?
It is fair, okay. As long as where I wanted to take the business fitted in with what funding was available, that's absolutely fine. What you get from Development Bank of Wales is, actually, I want to diversify into this. There isn't a pool of funding specifically aimed at that. They're much more flexible in what you can actually invest in, and you do get somebody to talk to.
Thank you, and congratulations with the business.
Thank you. Thank you.
Ruth Jones, please.
Thank you. Ms. Wallace-Jones, you've already highlighted some of the issues that you've experienced along your journey, if you like, and you've worked with both the Development Bank of Wales and Business Wales, and I wonder how you can compare and contrast the help and support you've had from them.
Business Wales, again, fits into the tick box exercise usually. They're specifically, from a funding perspective, there's specific pools of funding and you're either eligible for that or you're not. From a support point of view, and I'm maybe talking out of turn here, but it seems to me that they're more, their focus is on smaller businesses, which was great when I was smaller, and as I'm getting bigger and more experienced, I find that if I go to their meetings, if I network with them, I'm actually giving the support rather than taking it. So I find that I've slightly outgrown them. Perhaps that's not a good thing to be saying, but I do think it's more angled at the startups. And I think there's potentially a little bit of a gap Well, I'm on the Accelerated Growth Programme, which is an arm of it. So I suppose that's what they've developed for bigger companies, faster growth companies, and they've put in the consultants for us, I suppose.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you very clearly articulated in previous answers about the financial support and the advisory support and how they don't necessarily come together. As a business, how would you want to be communicated with by these people, in terms of the support? Because you've already mentioned how difficult it is to actually work out which track you're on and everything.
From a support perspective, I think it would be really nice. I don't know if this would be possible, but I think it would be really nice to have some sort of pool or database of people across the UK. It doesn't have to be Wales. I mean, we can travel. There's Zoom. Mm-hmm. It's just getting those, because we've settled. We've got a really good management team. Business as usual is absolutely fine, but we have various projects, and what we need is that little spark of knowledge, that extra little bit, when we're looking at exporting into the EU now seamlessly, actually a very difficult area. And what I would love to have is a database of somebody that says, right, export, okay, B2B, which is actually quite a different animal to B2C, which is, I'm in the B2B game. Where could I go? Who could I speak to? There will be people out there that know how to do this, and I really want someone, and we've been struggling over the last 6 months with the expertise of how to do it. But there will be somebody there who can do it, who's done it really well. Where are they? How can I speak to them, And I think if you could join up, if you could have this network of people across the UK that we could access, of good people, that would be absolutely amazing.
I hope somebody's listening to that.
Yes,
thank you very
hopefully.
much. I'll hand you back to the chair.
Well, we are intending to do a session with the export team that focuses on Welsh businesses with the at the Department of Business and Trade. So we might get some answers for you to feedback.
That would be great.
We've slightly overrun, and I'm sure we could carry on with a great many more questions, but it's been really helpful and insightful. So thank you again for joining us this morning to be part of the discussion. Wish you every success. Jane, it's been a fairly inspirational journey, I think, just reading your background and
meeting you.
Professor Jones-Evans in his remarks made reference to the aspiration of seeing more women leading and growing businesses in Wales. Do you get called on to kind of not give lectures, but to talk to and inspire other women in Wales who are setting out on the business journey?
I do, but I'm very inclusive, and I'm very inclusive of men too. And I do feel that we've got to, it's probably quite a controversial thing to say, but I do think we've got to have a level playing field, and I think we all need to be leading businesses, leading anything by merit. And I think it's really important that we listen to everyone. Sometimes I come in on women-only groups and I think, I'd really like my managers to be listening to this, my male managers, Yeah. We've got more or less a 50-50 balance, and we are quite diverse in all areas. But it's by merit, and I think that's really important. Mm-hmm. So...
Can I just ask, you talked about being with NatWest, I think it was, for the last 40 years plus as a business customer. Is it always with the same branch? Or has your local branch closed in that time?
Well, most of them have closed, yes. So it keeps moving. And to be honest, I see very few people. I mean, I'm old enough to have actually had a bank manager. Mm-hmm. So years ago, I did have a personal bank manager. They went completely. I didn't have any support at all because I was a small business. And as I've grown, I've gone into the, I do have a relationship manager now. But you don't really have a bank anymore. Do you know what I mean? You don't have a place to go to. It's all done online or...
One of the main high street banks told me a few weeks ago that their future model in Wales is 6 branches only, and they said that every other bank is going to go the same way. And Professor Jones-Evans, I mean, does that kind of scenario, does that fill you with fear in terms of small businesses starting out, or actually is what Jane Wallace-Jones saying absolutely right, that look, people can just go online and find the answers they need?
Well, many small businesses, particularly those starting up, particularly in, shall we say, artisan trades, will be dealing in cash. Yeah. And so it's going to be an issue. I think what potentially is one sort of solution to this is how we get the credit unions to work more closely. where there is that gap. And, you know, there's always been promises about bringing these hubs into different places. But credit unions are already there doing this sort of work and can actually take money as well as lend money. So, you know, there is a network of credit unions already out there that would be useful. But it is fascinating because if you look at the way businesses are, I think the figure is still about 80 to 85% of businesses will never change their bank, which is fascinating when you think about that, you know, there is allegedly competition there. But we found that but now increasingly, particularly startups, because of the ease of setting up an account, will go to the new challenger banks. So when we did our survey of the Startup Award companies, 30-odd% were with Starling. They were the leading bank for startup businesses. NatWest was second, but NatWest has always been lead. But to think that, you know, but we found that out of the 10, 5 were challenger banks, the top 10. So now these challenger banks, they're just making it easier. You can open an account. I could do it on my phone now, waiting for the next question. But that's, I think, is going to make it easier. But I think the problem is how do you then access funding, because Starling aren't really set up to provide the sort of funding that's, shall we say, a growing business. Not yet. So then, you know, that's why the role of, if you're with Starling, that's why the role of organisations like the Development Bank, particularly for startups, is really important.
Thank you very much. As I said, we could carry on this conversation for much longer because it's something that we're all got an interest in with respect to our own constituencies and what we're seeing in our local communities. But thank you again. We may follow up with some questions in writing, depending on our considerations after this and the next session that we're planning to do. But thank you again. Bringing the meeting to a close. Order.
Thank you.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.